All right, so today we're diving into a case that's been making headlines for a while now, the allegations against Marilyn Manson. And it's heavy stuff, you know? You've got this shock rock figure, someone who built a career on pushing boundaries. But then you have these really serious accusations, and it's clear the music world and the legal system, frankly, are wrestling with how to handle it all. So we've got a stack of articles here all about the latest developments. And one thing that really stood out is that the LA District Attorney still hasn't made a decision about charges.
Yeah, the timeline on this is, well, it's definitely something. I mean, the Sheriff's Department was on this for 19 months.
Yeah.
19 months of investigation before they finally handed their findings over to the DA.
Yeah.
And that was last September. So we're talking well over a year later, and still no decision from the DA.
Over a year. Wow. Okay, so that's a long time regardless. But for a case this big, this public, it feels even longer, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And I saw the DA, George Gascon, is saying there's new evidence that's come up recently. Is that common? To have these delays even after what seemed like, at least from the outside, a really thorough investigation.
Well, you have to remember, historical abuse allegations, especially when you're talking about someone famous, they require a really, really deep dive. It's not just about finding evidence. It's about making sure it holds up, verifying dates, all of that gets magnified when it's a high-profile case like this.
Right, of course. And it just adds so many more layers, like you said. And, speaking of time, these allegations go back to between 2009 and 2011, if I remember correctly from the article. So we're talking over a decade ago at this point.
Exactly. And that brings its own set of legal challenges.
Oh, for sure. Like what kind of things are impacted by that kind of time frame?
Well, the statute of limitations is a big one. That's always a factor in these cases, but especially when you're dealing with a gap like that. Plus, memories fade. Witnesses, even those directly involved, it becomes harder and harder to put together exactly what happened so long ago. And that has huge implications for things like proving consent, which is often the central issue in these cases.
That makes sense. Yeah. It's like proving something happened is one thing, but then the context, the consent, it all gets so much more blurry with time. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? Because we haven't even gotten into the multiple accusers and the different legal paths their cases have taken.
Exactly. Each of those is its own story, and they all feed into the bigger picture here.
And it's important to remember, right? This isn't just based on one person's account. We're talking about multiple women who've come forward with allegations against Manson.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Each with their own experience, their own story.
And, reading through these articles, one name that really jumped out, at least for me, was Esmé Bianco. I mean, a lot of people will know her from Game of Thrones, and she settled her lawsuit with Manson earlier this year. And then there's Evan Rachel Wood, right, who is actually engaged to Manson at one point. And she's been, incredibly open about the abuse she says she experienced during their relationship. But I imagine with a case like this, it's rarely as straightforward as just he said, she said, especially once lawyers get involved.
Oh, absolutely not. These situations are so nuanced, and often you have these parallel legal things happening all at once. It gets complicated fast.
Well, and that's what I find so interesting about this case in particular, right? You've got these various accusations, lawsuits flying around, and then Manson himself countersues for defamation.
Exactly. And just to clarify for listeners, a defamation suit basically means he's claiming someone hurt his reputation by saying things that aren't true.
Okay, that makes sense. But then, you've also got situations like Ashley Morgan Smithline. She's another accuser, but she actually recanted her allegations last year. So how does that kind of thing impact how the public perceives everything, especially when you have these very different outcomes happening alongside each other?
It's a great question, and it's a huge part of what makes these cases so tricky. Because you're right, when someone recants, it introduces this element of doubt. And it can absolutely influence how people view not just that particular accusation, but also the other ones, even impact other legal stuff going on. It's a reminder that it's not always about legal facts. It's about perception, about what people believe. And that's a whole other layer on top of everything else.
Wow. Yeah, you're right. It's almost like two separate court cases, right? The actual legal one, and then this court of public opinion happening at the same time. It's just, I don't know, it's a lot to process, and we're over here talking about it, trying to make sense of it all. But the articles mention that Manson is, maintaining his innocence through all of this. And meanwhile, he's still out there, still working, still making music.
Right, and that's where you see someone like Esmé Bianco, and I'm sure others feel similarly, expressing their frustration. Because, think about it. She's been dealing with this for years, right? Years of her life, waiting for some kind of resolution, some sense of closure. And the person she's accused is just, carrying on. It's got to be hard, To be in that position, feeling like the system is moving so slowly, if it's moving at all, well, he's just living his life.
Yeah, absolutely. And that makes me think, like, what does that say to other potential victims? If you're out there and you see a case like this dragging on years and years, no real end in sight, it just makes you wonder, would you even bother coming forward, knowing what you might be in for?
That's the really insidious thing about these drawn-out, high-profile cases. Even if someone is thinking about coming forward, they see this and it's like, what's the point? And that's not to say the legal process shouldn't be thorough. Of course it should. But the toll it takes, the emotional energy it requires, it's huge.
It is. It's a lot. And I think it's easy to get caught up in the headlines, right? Especially with someone as, I don't know, as notorious as Marilyn Manson. But at the heart of it, this is about real people, real lives impacted. And it highlights how complicated this stuff is, the legal system, the court of public opinion, all of it.
Absolutely. And I think what you're getting at is so important, which is that we need to be having these conversations, not just about Manson, but about how we as a society approach these situations, how we support survivors, how we think about justice, all of it.
Yeah, and it's not about rushing to judgment. It's about being willing to engage with the nuance, the gray areas, because there are always going to be gray areas in cases like this.
Exactly. And that's where I think this deep dive has been so valuable. It's challenged us to look beyond the surface, to really grapple with the complexity of it all. And honestly, I think that's something we all need to be doing more of, not just with this case, but with every...
Well said. If there's one thing I hope our listeners take away from this, it's that this is a conversation that goes way beyond any one case or any one person. It's about all of us and how we choose to move forward, how we choose to listen to each other, how we choose to support survivors, how we choose to seek justice. This has been, without a doubt, one of our most thought-provoking deep dives yet. And I want to thank you, not just for your insights today, but for being willing to go there with us to really unpack all of this.
Of course, it's been my pleasure. These are difficult conversations to have, for sure, but they're necessary.
They are. And on that note, to everyone listening, thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Keep those conversations going, stay curious, and stay informed.